Thomas Miggly Jr. He invented two of the most destructive chemicals in human history. Then he invented the machine that strangled him. Thomas Miggly Jr. was the most brilliant and most dangerous chemist of the 20th century. In the 1920s, while working for General Motors, he discovered that adding tetraethyl lead to gasoline eliminated engine knock. He called it ethyl. The world called it leaded gasoline. It worked beautifully. It also poisoned the entire planet. Lead is a neurotoxin. Every car that burned leaded fuel pumped microscopic lead particles into the atmosphere. Children breathed it. It settled into soil, water, and food. Studies would later estimate that leaded gasoline lowered the average IQ of an entire generation by several points and contributed to a massive spike in violent crime across the industrialized world. Miggly knew the dangers. He held a press conference in 1924 where he washed his hands in tetraethyl lead and breathed its fumes for 60 seconds to prove it was safe. Shortly after, he had to take an extended leave of absence to recover from lead poisoning. Then he did it again. In the 1930s, Miggly invented Freon, the first chlorofluorocarbon, as a safe refrigerant. It replaced the toxic ammonia and sulfur dioxide used in early refrigerators. It seemed like a miracle. Odorless, non-flammable, non-toxic to humans. It was also eating a hole in the ozone layer. Freon and its CFC cousins would eventually tear open a gap in Earth's atmospheric shield above Antarctica, so large it threatened to increase radiation exposure for the entire southern hemisphere. One historian later wrote that Miggly had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. Two inventions. One poisoned the ground, the other poisoned the sky. In 1940, Miggly contracted polio and lost the use of his legs. Ever the engineer, he designed an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys attached to his bed so he could lift and turn himself without help. On November 2nd, 1944, at age 55, Thomas Miggly Jr. became tangled in his own invention. The ropes wrapped around his neck and strangled him to death. The man whose creations choked the planet was choked by the last thing he ever built. Franz Reichelt. He believed his coat could make a man fly. He proved himself wrong from the first deck of the Eiffel Tower. Franz Reichelt was an Austrian-born tailor living in Paris who became obsessed with one idea: a wearable parachute. In the early 1900s, aviation was exploding, and pilots were dying in crashes with no way to bail out safely. Reichelt believed he could design a suit, part overcoat, part parachute, that would allow a person to jump from a plane and float safely to the ground. He spent years building prototypes. He tested them using dummies dropped from his apartment window, 5 stories up. The results were mixed. Some tests showed the fabric catching air. Most showed the dummy cratering into the ground, but Reichelt kept adjusting. More fabric, different folds, a wider canopy. He was convinced that the problem wasn't the design, it was the height. His apartment window wasn't tall enough for the parachute to fully deploy. He needed more altitude. He needed the Eiffel Tower. On February 4th, 1912, Reichelt convinced Parisian authorities to let him conduct a test from the tower's first platform, about 187 feet above the ground. The permit was granted under the assumption he would use a dummy, as he had before. Reichelt arrived wearing the suit himself. Reporters and cameramen gathered below. Friends tried to talk him out of it. Reichelt stood on the railing, hesitated for nearly 40 seconds. The film footage shows him visibly trembling, and jumped. The parachute didn't open. Not partially. Not at all. The fabric wrapped around his body like a shroud. He fell for 4 seconds and hit the frozen ground at approximately 60 miles per hour. He was dead on impact. The fall created a measurable dent in the earth. A doctor confirmed death immediately. Newsreel cameras captured the entire thing. The hesitation, the jump, the fall, the crater. It remains one of the earliest filmed deaths in history. Reichelt had spent years trusting his invention with test after test after test. When every test told him it wasn't ready, he decided the tests were wrong. He bet his life that he was right. He was wrong for 4 seconds. William Bullock. He built the machine that printed the modern world. Then it pulled him in and crushed him. In 1863, William Bullock invented the Webb rotary printing press. Before Bullock, printing was slow. Sheets had to be fed individually into the press. Bullock's machine used a continuous roll of paper, a web that fed automatically through the press at high speed. It could print, cut, and fold 10,000 sheets per hour. It was faster, cheaper, and more efficient than anything that had come before. It revolutionized the newspaper industry. Suddenly, mass circulation dailies were possible. Information could reach millions. Bullock's press didn't just print papers. It created the modern media. But the machine was a beast. It ran on massive rollers, gears, and belts that moved at tremendous speed with no safety guards. Operators worked inches from spinning metal that could grab a loose sleeve, a finger, a shoelace, and pull a man into the mechanism before anyone could hit a switch. On April 3, 1867, Bullock was installing a new press at the Philadelphia Public Ledger when he tried to kick a driving belt onto a pulley. His leg was caught in the machine. The rollers pulled him in and crushed his leg below the knee. Doctors attempted to amputate, but gangrene set in during surgery. William Bullock died 4 days later. He was 54. The press he invented went on to transform publishing worldwide. It was the backbone of every major newspaper for generations. But its creator never saw any of it. He was killed by the same spinning mechanism that made his machine revolutionary. A machine that moved so fast and so powerfully that the moment it grabbed you, it was already too late. Marie Curie. She discovered what was killing her. She held it in her hands every day for 30 years. Marie Curie didn't invent radiation. She discovered it, named it, isolated it, and carried it in her pockets. She is the only person in history to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different sciences: physics in 1903 and chemistry in 1911. She discovered 2 elements, polonium and radium. She developed mobile X-ray units during World War I that saved thousands of soldiers' lives on the battlefield. She is arguably the most important female scientist who ever lived. She also had no idea what her discovery was doing to her body. In the late 1890s, Curie and her husband Pierre worked in a converted shed at the École de Physique in Paris. They had no proper ventilation. They processed tons of pitchblende ore by hand, boiling it in open vats, stirring it for hours, inhaling the fumes. Marie carried test tubes of radioactive isotopes in her coat pockets. She kept them in her desk drawers. She described the eerie blue glow of radium in the dark as one of the most beautiful things she had ever seen. Pierre was killed in a traffic accident in 1906, struck by a horse-drawn carriage on a Paris street. Marie continued the work alone. For 3 more decades, she handled radioactive materials with bare hands. Her fingers were burned and scarred. Her notebooks are still so radioactive that they're kept in lead-lined boxes at the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. Anyone who wants to read them must sign a liability waiver and wear protective clothing. By the late 1920s, Curie's health was in collapse. Chronic fatigue, cataracts in both eyes, persistent buzzing in her ears. Her blood counts were plummeting. On July 4th, 1934, Marie Curie died at a sanatorium in the French Alps. The cause was aplastic anemia. Her bone marrow had been destroyed by decades of radiation exposure. She was 66. The element she loved most, radium, had been dismantling her from the inside out for her entire career. She held the thing that was killing her and called it beautiful. And even knowing what we know now, her research saved more lives than it took. The X-ray machines she built, The radiation therapy she pioneered, the science that killed Marie Curie, went on to save millions. She just wasn't one of them. Henry Winstanley. He built the first real lighthouse in history. Then he dared the sea to tear it down. Henry Winstanley was an English engineer, painter, and showman who made his fortune building eccentric attractions, a house rigged with trick chairs, tilting floors, and doors that dumped visitors into water. He was a performer and a prankster, but in the 1690s, he turned serious. Two of his merchant ships had been wrecked on the Eddystone Rocks, a jagged reef 14 miles off the coast of Plymouth, England. The reef was a graveyard. Ships struck it constantly in bad weather and at night. Hundreds of sailors had drowned there. Winstanley decided to do something no one had done before. He would build a lighthouse on top of the reef. The engineering was considered impossible. The Eddystone Rocks were submerged at high tide. They were battered by Atlantic storms that produced 60-foot waves. Construction crews could only work for a few hours between tides, standing in freezing water on slippery rock. Winstanley was kidnapped by a French privateer during construction and held prisoner until Queen Anne personally negotiated his release. He went back and kept building. The first Eddystone Lighthouse was completed in 1698, a wooden tower anchored to the rock with iron stanchions, 80 feet tall, topped with a lantern visible for miles. It worked. Ships stopped wrecking on the reef. Sailors praised it as a miracle. Winstanley reinforced and expanded the structure in 1699, making it taller and stronger. He was so proud of his creation, so confident in its strength, that he made a public declaration. He said he wished to be inside the lighthouse during the greatest storm that ever was. On November 26, 1703, he got his wish. The Great Storm of 1703, the most violent tempest in recorded British history, struck southern England with sustained hurricane-force winds. Winstanley was inside the lighthouse performing routine maintenance. When morning came, the lighthouse was gone. Not damaged, not toppled. Gone. The sea had ripped the entire structure from the rock and swallowed it whole. There was nothing left but a few bent iron bolts embedded in the stone. Winstanley's body was never found. He had dared the ocean to test his invention. The ocean accepted. Horace Lawson Hunley. He built the first submarine to sink an enemy warship. It sank him twice first. In the middle of the American Civil War, the Confederacy was desperate. The Union Navy had blockaded southern ports, strangling trade and starving the war effort. The South didn't have the industrial capacity to build a fleet that could fight the Union head-on. So a group of engineers in Mobile, Alabama, tried something no one had successfully done before. They built a submarine. Horace Lawson Hunley, a wealthy Louisiana lawyer and marine engineer, funded and helped design the vessel. It was a converted iron steam boiler, about 40 feet long and barely 4 feet in diameter. There was no engine. 8 men sat shoulder to shoulder on a bench, hand cranking a propeller shaft. The captain navigated through a tiny viewport and controlled the dive planes. There was no reserve air supply, no escape hatch. If anything went wrong, the crew drowned where they sat. Things went wrong almost immediately. On August 29, 1863, during a training dive in Charleston Harbor, the submarine's commander accidentally submerged the vessel with the hatches still open. Water flooded in. 5 of the 8 crew members drowned. The sub was raised, drained, and given a new crew. Hunley himself took command of the next crew to restore confidence. On October 15, 1863, during another training exercise, the submarine dove nose first into the harbor floor and didn't come back up. All 8 men aboard, including Horace Hunley, suffocated in the mud. When the sub was recovered weeks later, the crew was found at their stations. Hunley's body was pressed against the forward hatch, his hand still on the candle that served as his only light. The flame had consumed the last of their oxygen. The Confederacy raised the sub again, renamed it the H.L. Hunley in honor of its dead creator. Found another crew, volunteers who knew exactly what had happened to the previous two. On February 17th, 1864, the Hunley approached the USS Housatonic in the darkness off Charleston and drove a spar torpedo into the warship's hull. The explosion sank the Housatonic. It was the first time in history that a submarine had sunk an enemy vessel in combat. The Hunley never returned. It sank for the third and final time that same night, taking all 8 crew members with it. The wreck wasn't found until 1995, buried in silt on the ocean floor. When scientists opened the hull, the crew was still at their stations, hands on the crank, exactly where they died 131 years earlier. Horace Hunley built a weapon that changed naval warfare forever. It killed him before it ever killed the enemy. And when it finally succeeded, it took its last crew with it, as if the machine refused to let anyone survive what it had already taken from its creator.